A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back once again to video games that are totally awesome. So, for the rest of this week, I've got my mind set on the likes of Five Nights at Freddy's 3 and 4, as well as good old Sister Location, which I'll have a lot to say on that part. In any case, why don't we go ahead and get started with FNAF 3 before we do all that good stuff with parts 4 and 5, which is just known as Sister Location. But here we go. About 30 years had passed since the closure of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. And we know that with Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, some time had passed since its closure until the events of the first game take place. And it's possible that many more years had passed since the first game took place. And let's also remember that FNAF 2 takes place a little while before the events of the first game, likely when the place was still open. Because after all, there was a good amount of lore that had already gone down by this time in both the first and second game, considering the timeline that had been established and all the characters that we got to know about. Not to mention all the speculative pieces and all the riffraff that has since ensued. With the third game, however, while we've had some speculations on the timeline, being that with the first game, it takes place in its closure around the early 90s. Essentially, a little while after the events of 1987. That bite in particular with good old Mangle, yeah. And with the second game, we seemingly have ourselves a bit of time that's spent likely since that incident occurred. But with the third game, 30 years after the closure of Freddy Fazbear's means that part 3 likely takes place right around here in the slobbering 20s. A good 3 decades since that point in history? I guess it's more than appropriate that I do eventually get to talk about this game, regardless of what most people would speculate on. But the plot in this game does follow an attraction that is in fact going to host a lot of different artifacts from Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Fazbear Frights is what this place is going to be. And unlike with the other two games, where we have understanding of whom is in charge of running security, in this game, the security guard goes unnamed. But it's still the same sort of format as we know before. The security guard is inside of his office, and he's monitoring the cameras, audio, ventilation, and many other things within Fazbear Frights. But the main format of this game runs a bit differently than the others. You see, because while we unfortunately don't have that many animatronics to work with here, there is one in particular that you might be familiar with if you've done yourself some research with the previous two games. There was a certain person out there whom has been dubbed the Purple Guy, and in this game it's found that he apparently had found himself inside the spring locks of a certain animatronic character whom is essentially a decrepit bunny costume. And if you're wanting to know exactly whom the Purple Guy is, well, if anybody can guess it, that's right, William Afton himself. And as for the character's name, well, if the movie had taught us anything a couple years ago, it's that the original basin for this spring lock suit is known to be a spring version of Bonnie, simply called Spring Bonnie. But after some time passes in which that William Afton had taken control of the animatronic suit itself and the spring lock system inactivated, causing his body to become one with the innards of the suit itself, a lot of time had seemingly passed. And now, this character had gone on under the new pseudonym, the name Springtrap. And here's the thing though, he's certainly known to be the main antagonist of the franchise, at least a good majority of it, whether it be from the books, the games, and other such media. Even the movie made sure to have ourselves at least the precursor to Springtrap known as Spring Bonnie. But with the upcoming sequel that we have coming out in several months, I'm sure that we're going to have Five Nights at Freddy's 2 give us a little bit more than what we would have expected. But here's the thing though, in FNAF 3, the main thing about Fazbear Frights is that you got to take control of the cameras, audio systems, ventilation, but this Springtrap guy, He's out there to hunt you. All you can do, essentially, is create diversions and delay his entry into the office. By utilizing the cameras, ventilations, audio systems, you can distract him, steer him away from the office, or even lead him in the opposite direction. So that if he gets close to you, there's a good chance that he might actually not enter the office and instead go to wherever audio is playing in the background. But, as we know by now, there is a bit of a catch. Sometimes the audio, cameras, and ventilations will fail. A loud beeping noise will be found, and what you'd have to do from there is reboot the system. This will temporarily leave you defenseless, vulnerable enough so that Springtrap could enter the security room, but there is an added disadvantage that comes around here. If it happens in the ventilation system, and if it goes offline for too long, not enough oxygen will enter the room. And when that happens, the security guard will actually begin to hallucinate. No doubt because hypoxia had set in by this point. But it happens pretty quickly, not quite in a realistic standpoint. But then again, when you look at how fast the hours move from midnight to 6 a.m., much like the other games, FNAF 3 does follow the similar sort of thing where it's not real time and you gotta go maybe a few minutes per night. So every hour seemingly is like a minute or so worth of real time. So it at least does allow for you to make good, quick progress and move on to the next night in a jiffy. But we certainly got to talk a bit about the Phantom animatronics. Yes, Freddy, Chica, Foxy, Bonnie, they're now in the form of phantoms, illusions that will come out of nowhere and jump scare you. Yeah, but thankfully they don't actually kill you. No, they're just phantoms. They're illusions. They're hallucinations. Of course, they're not going to kill you directly, but they will cause you to panic in a minute. The real problem is, of course, if Springtrap comes around, enters the office, you're done for. He's the only character in the game that actually will kill you and create a game over. With everything else that goes on now, it's a pretty big fight that goes down. Trying to see if the office and the electronics could comply with you while you take a look in the cameras and eventually get the oxygen flowing again in the ventilation system. Avoiding hallucinations. You know, there's a lot more multitasking that goes on around here. It's not like with the first game, which all you had to do was to keep a good lookout in the cameras and eventually close the doors or save power whenever necessary. With the second game, there were many more animatronics to look out for, plus the wind-up of Puppet's music box, and the occasional other stuff that goes around with some of the other characters. At the end of the day, though, with Part 3 allowing for us to take on the same sort of general formats of gameplay, but with the added bits of having to reboot the system, monitor the ventilation and whatnot, because unlike with the other two, now you're vulnerable to hypoxia, and as a result, you'll end up seeing things that aren't actually there. It's nice that they don't kill you, but it's more of a guise. That Springtrap can now pave his way directly into the office and just slaughter you like cattle. I might as well also mention, though, that with the dialogue that goes on with the phones between the caller and receiver, what we have here is some talk going on about how Freddy Fazbear is unfortunately devolved into a not so great sightly location, but also because of the fact that Fazbear Frights is going to be the next best thing for the Freddy Fazbear entertainment. It seemingly does bring us to a point of which that it almost reboots the franchise. Knowing that the first game took place sometime after the closure of the first events of the first game here, and then with Part 2 seemingly taking place before the major closure happened, with 3, we now have ourselves quite a timeline to construct. Something that's kept a lot of minds busy over the years. But look at how the timeline has gone on now. A lot of them are seemingly not as canon or are simply just fan works that are put together. There are a lot of Five Nights at Freddy's titles that unfortunately don't really fit in with the timeline as it seems. Many of them just stray off or just spin-offs from the franchise. But with the security breach continuity beginning as far back as 2020, they have actually tried to reinstate the timeline back to its original roots. Security Breach obviously does take place a while after the events of the other games, parts 1 through 4 especially. There, of course, was also the likes of Sister Location and many other things that came around. But with the invention of the Fazbear Pizzaplex, it, of course, was an entirely different paradigm shift that really expanded upon what the Freddy Fazbear's Entertainment could do, and more importantly, how much more capable could life actually turn out for the many characters, old and new, in this franchise. It really goes to show that we're probably not going to have a shortage of ideas here. Next thing you know, Scott Cawthon could invent something way more crazier. With Secret of the Mimic coming out, it's possible that the Mimic itself could probably tie up the loose ends that were established in the Ruin DLC of Security Breach, but we can't be sure of that at the moment because the game has yet to come out. And the trailers don't really make everything clear enough. But to top all of this off, Part 3 still is a unique and somewhat handy way of keeping the franchise contained. Because even though the grim tone of the first 2 games had been lost, the third game still did establish a unique basin from which that jump scares as well as newer characters could be put through into the franchise. And since then, with the 4th game coming out that same year in 2015, I'll have a lot more to talk about. Part 4 seemingly has done a lot better than what 3 had done. And in terms of how well all 4 of the games have done, well, I guess when I get my review of Part 4 done tomorrow, we'll have some more to talk about based on what's best and what's not so best. But for Part 3, it's still a pretty decent game for what it is overall. I do like the idea of how they were able to instill more complex mechanics as well as multitasking abilities to keep us busy, but more importantly to stray off the ultimate threat, which we now know is one of the most major antagonists in the franchise, Springtrap. And because of how big his popularity has gotten since then, it's no wonder why Springtrap is considered the quintessential antagonist, because William Afton himself, he's the man behind all this stuff. He's the man not only behind the spring locks and Freddy Fazbear Entertainment, but the idea of the animatronics entirely, at least the way that this plot line is detailed. And because of all the information revolving around him, and even his famous curse line, known as "I always come back." Just think, it's like after Terminator said, "I'll be back," or Darth Vader yells, "No!" Or even when Dr. Doofenshmirtz from Phineas and Ferb yells, "Curse you, Perry the Platypus." You know, there's always going to be a character that's going to have such a big, memorable quote. One that'll be spoken multiple times, even. But at the end of the day, Springtrap is another one of those characters with the unique, somewhat cliche quote that they themselves are famous for. And it is true after all. Springtrap always comes back. Much like many other characters we've seen over the years. And even Security Breach has ensured that he'd have a big place in the franchise. Today, it's possible that it might happen again in another continuity that could be established. We have yet to see how that goes down. Anyways, though, for my final scoring of Part 3, we'll just give it a good 7.1 out of 10.1. Probably not as high of scoring as with the other 2 games, but trust me, Part 4 is going to blow a lot of things out of the water in comparison to 3. Until then, though, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.